Welcome to another deep dive, everybody. Today we're tackling, a period in church history that might make you like, how could this happen?
Oh, yeah.
The Western Schism, when multiple people claim to be the true pope.
Oh.
It's a wild story, but believe it or not, it can help us understand the church better even today.
It might seem strange, but these periods of chaos are actually windows into how the church works.
Yeah.
And this one, the Western Schism, reveals a lot about leadership authority, the human side of the church.
So we're talking late 1300s, early 1400s.
Right.
Multiple popes, excommunications, flying around kingdoms, picking sides based on who they disliked more.
Yeah, it was really a mess.
And even the saints were divided.
A mess is putting it mildly. To really understand the Western Schism, we need to rewind a bit to the Avignon Papacy.
Okay.
For about 70 years, the popes had been living in Avignon, France. But in 1376, Pope Gregory XI decided to move back to Rome.
Rome is Rome after all.
Yeah.
But I bet that wasn't an easy move.
Not at all. Gregory XI died soon after returning, and the people of Rome were determined to have a Roman pope.
Oh, yeah.
They put immense pressure on the cardinals, even threatening violence, just to get their way.
Wow.
Imagine the atmosphere during that papal election.
Talk about a pressure cooker. Not exactly the Holy Spirit guiding things, is it?
Right.
So how did the cardinals respond to all this pressure?
Well, they elected a Roman Urban VI.
Hey.
And it seemed like everyone was on board at first, even those who later opposed him.
Oh, so this is where things start to go sideways.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me about this Urban VI. What happened?
He seemed like a reformer initially, which is what a lot of people wanted, but then his personality took a sharp turn.
Right.
He became erratic and confrontational, pushing away many of his early supporters.
So even St. Catherine of Siena, who was not afraid to speak her mind, she got involved, right?
She did, and she didn't hold back criticizing both Urban VI and the cardinals who rebelled against him.
Wow.
She saw dysfunction on both sides.
That's fascinating that even someone as holy as Catherine of Siena got caught up in all this drama. It really shows how deep those divisions ran.
It does.
But how did this dissatisfaction with Urban VI lead to an actual schism, like a full-blown split in the church?
Well, the cardinals, who were fed up with Urban VI, fled Rome and decided to elect their own Pope Clement VII in 1378.
Oh, wow.
Now you have two centers of papal authority, Rome under Urban VI and Avignon under Clement VII, and that's when Christendom had to choose a side.
So you're telling me this was less about theology and more about who do you dislike less?
Pretty much.
What a predicament to be in, and to make matters worse, political alliances came into play, right?
Absolutely. France naturally backed the Avignon Pope Clement VI, and their allies followed suit.
Okay.
The kingdoms that opposed France, on the other hand, stay loyal to the Roman Pope Urban VI.
You'd think they would have called a big meeting, a council, to sort this mess out.
They did. They called the Council of Pisa in 1409, hoping to resolve the schism. However, instead of fixing the problem, they ended up electing a third pope, Alexander V.
Oh, wow, a third pope. You've got to be kidding me. So now it's even more complicated.
Yeah.
So what happened? Did this new pope manage to unite everyone?
Not exactly. Alexander V's reign was brief, about 10 months before he died in 1410, under mysterious circumstances.
Oh, wow.
But here's a twist. In the 20th century, the church officially removed Alexander V and his successor, John the XXIII, from the list of legitimate popes.
Right.
They're now considered anti-popes.
So they were basically erased from the official record, but back in the 15th century, they were still very much part of the problem.
Yeah.
And then there's this whole schism within a schism situation you mentioned earlier.
Right.
That sounds like a whole other level of confusion.
Oh, you're talking about Benedict III. He had succeeded Clement VII as the Avignon Pope.
Okay.
And even after the Council of Pisa with its new Pope, Benedict XIII, refused to step down.
He must have been a real piece of work. What was he thinking?
Well, Benedict III was extremely determined, even stubborn. Over time, even some of his supporters started losing patience with him.
Yeah.
Eventually, France itself withdrew its support, which created a schism within a schism.
So even the people who put him in power were saying enough is enough. It sounds like a soap opera.
Yeah, it really does.
But at some point, this had to end, right? The church couldn't stay divided forever.
You're absolutely right. And that brings us to the Council of Constance. In 1414, this council was determined to finally put an end to the chaos, and they took some pretty dramatic measures.
I can only imagine, was there a lot of negotiating and arguing, or did they just throw everyone out and start over?
There was definitely arguing and negotiating, but they also took decisive action. They deposed John the XXIII, the Pisan Pope, Gregory XII. The Roman Pope agreed to step down, and after a lot of resistance, Benedict XIII was finally dismissed.
Oh, wow.
With all three claimants out of the picture, the council elected Martin V as the new pope in 1417.
Finally, one pope. What a relief that must have been for the church. But wait a minute, you said they deposed John XXIII and dismissed Benedict XIII. That sounds a bit forceful coming from a council.
That's an excellent point. The council taking those actions raises a big question. Does a council have authority over the pope? It's a question that's been debated for centuries, and we'll talk more about that later, but at the time it seemed like the only way to end the chaos.
So Martin V steps into this situation.
Yeah.
He's got a huge task ahead of him, restoring order, rebuilding Rome, and dealing with all the fallout from the schism. I imagine he had his work cut out for him.
You can say that again, and he wasn't afraid of controversy, which is something we'll discuss in the next part of our deep dive.
This is all fascinating stuff, but I can see how it might leave some people wondering, if the church can go through something this crazy, what does it say about its authority, its leadership, and how do we reconcile this mess with our faith today?
That's a really important question, and that's why we're doing this deep dive, to show that even though the church went through this incredibly difficult period, it actually highlights the church's resilience. It shows us how the church, guided by the Holy Spirit, can overcome even the most divisive challenges. But to really understand this, we need to dig deeper into the aftermath of the schism and the lessons we can learn from it.
I'm ready to keep digging. So let's move on to part 2, where we'll explore how the church emerged from this crisis and what it means for us today. Okay, so we've seen how the Western Schism threw the church into absolute chaos. But what happened next? How did the church recover from this? And what can we as Catholics today learn from this wild period in history?
It's amazing to think that even after such a major crisis, the church was able to pick up the pieces and move forward. And this period of turmoil actually gave rise to some important ideas about church governance, especially the concept of conciliarism.
Conciliarism, that sounds a bit intimidating. Can you explain what that is?
It's actually a pretty straightforward idea. Conciliarism basically argued that a general council of the church holds more authority than the pope, especially when it comes to big issues like faith doctrine or resolving something as dramatic as a schism.
So it's kind of like a system of checks and balances within the church. The Pope isn't an absolute monarch, but part of a larger structure.
That's a great way to put it. Conciliarists believed that the Pope should be accountable to the church as a whole, represented by a council, and this idea gained a lot of traction during the schism because, let's be honest, councils seem like the only way to resolve the problem of having multiple popes running around.
It makes sense that people would start questioning the traditional power structures after witnessing such dysfunction at the top, but I can't imagine the popes were too happy about this whole idea of conciliarism.
You're right, they weren't thrilled. Conciliarism directly challenged the idea of papal supremacy, the belief that the Pope has ultimate authority in the Church. This tension between conciliarism and papal supremacy has continued to play out throughout Church history.
It sounds like the schism really shook things up, forcing the Church to re-examine how it operates. What other long-term impacts did this schism have on the papacy?
Well, for a while, it significantly weakened the Pope's authority. I mean, when you have rival popes excommunicating each other and kingdoms choosing sides based on political convenience, it's hard to project an image of unity and strong leadership.
It's like that saying, too many cooks spoil the broth, or in this case, too many popes spoil the church.
Exactly. This weakened papacy meant that the popes couldn't effectively respond to other challenges that were cropping up at the time, things like the rise of reform movements, some of which, like the Hussites, became quite radical.
So the schism created a sort of power vacuum that allowed other dissenting voices to grow stronger.
You got it. And regaining the authority they had lost was a long and difficult process for the popes. They had to reassert their spiritual leadership while also consolidating their political power, especially in the papal states and throughout Europe.
I imagine that involved a bit of historical revisionism, too. I mean, we already talked about how the church officially declared those Avignon and Pisan popes to be illegitimate.
You're absolutely right. Removing those popes from the official record was a key part of reestablishing this idea of a single, unbroken line of popes, going all the way back to St. Peter. It was like cleaning up the family tree and presenting a united front.
It makes sense you need a clear lineage to reinforce the idea of papal authority. But even with all that historical tidying up, there are still some big questions left unanswered. Like, how can we be sure who the rightful pope was during all that chaos?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And unfortunately, there's no easy answer. The Church, as we've discussed, officially recognizes the Roman line of popes as the legitimate one. But even some Catholic scholars have debated this, and there are strong arguments on both sides.
It's enough to make your head spin for everyday Catholics like us. How are we supposed to make sense of this? Does this mean we should doubt everything the Church teaches?
Absolutely not. Here's what's important to remember. The church is made up of human beings, and we're all imperfect. We make mistakes, we mess things up, and sometimes our egos and ambitions get the better of us, and that's true for everyone, including popes and cardinals.
So the Western Schism wasn't about a mistake in the Church's teaching, but about human failing. It's a reminder that even in matters of faith, human weakness is always a factor.
That's a great way to put it. It's a reminder that the church is a human institution guided by the Holy Spirit, but still subject to the limitations and imperfections of humanity. It's not this perfect, untouchable entity, but a living body of believers who are all trying to follow Christ.
That's actually a comforting thought. It makes the Church seem more real, more relatable. We're all in this together trying our best.
Exactly. And what's truly inspiring is that even in the middle of this crisis, the faith of most Catholics stayed strong. They continued to believe in the church, even when they weren't sure who the legitimate pope was.
So even with the leaders squabbling, the ordinary faithful remain steadfast. That says a lot about the deep roots of faith.
It does, and that to me is the ultimate testament to the resilience of the church. It has endured countless challenges throughout its history, heresies, scandals, wars, and yes, even schisms, and yet it has survived, guided by the Holy Spirit and sustained by the faith of its people. The Western Schism, though a difficult chapter, is part of that larger story of resilience.
I'm starting to see why you said at the beginning that studying this chaotic period can actually be helpful. It forces us to look beyond this idealized image of the church and acknowledge its complexity, its human side.
Exactly. Wrestling with those difficult questions is part of what it means to be Catholic. We're not called to blind obedience, but to informed faith, a faith that seeks understanding even in the face of challenges.
Informed faith. I love that it means engaging with our history, even the messy parts, and learning from it.
Precisely. And the Western Schism, with all its drama and intrigue, offers a unique opportunity to do just that.
So we've covered a lot of ground. We've explored the origins of the schism, the rise and fall of rival popes, the attempts to fix things through councils, and now the long-term impact of this whole ordeal. But for our listeners who are trying to understand the church today, what are the key takeaways from all this?
I think one of the biggest takeaways is that the church, even in times of division and uncertainty, has an amazing ability to self-correct. The Western Schism led to important reforms like strengthening the role of councils, which helped prevent similar crises from happening later on.
So the church learned from its mistakes. It's good to know that even the church can grow and evolve.
Absolutely. It's a continuous process of learning, adapting, and responding to new challenges.
The schism also highlights the importance of individual conscience and discernment. Even when church leaders were giving conflicting messages, Catholics had to figure out who to follow.
That's a great point. While the church provides guidance and authority, ultimately each person has a responsibility to form their own conscience and seek truth. And sometimes that involves asking tough questions, wrestling with ambiguity, and even disagreeing with those in authority.
It sounds like you're saying blind faith isn't enough. We need to engage critically with our faith and make informed decisions.
Exactly. Blind obedience isn't what our faith calls for. It's about seeking truth, understanding our faith, and forming our conscience in light of what we learn.
This all leads to a really intriguing question. Does studying the Western Schism make us question the idea of papal infallibility? Or does it actually reinforce our belief in the Church's ability to overcome even the most divisive challenges?
That's the million-dollar question. It's something each of us needs to grapple with, and it might lead to some really interesting conversations about the nature of faith authority and what it means to be Catholic.
Well said on that thought-provoking note. We'll wrap up this part of our deep dive, but stay tuned, because in the final part, we'll explore how different people throughout history have interpreted the Western Schism. It might surprise you how differently this event has been viewed over the centuries. Welcome back to our deep dive into the Western Schism. We've uncovered the historical details and the political maneuvering and the theological debates. Now, let's step back and consider how this period has been viewed throughout history. You might be surprised to learn that the Western Schism has been interpreted in many different ways, often reflecting the perspectives of those doing the interpreting.
It's a fascinating phenomenon, really. How we view the schism often reveals as much about our own present-day concerns and biases as it does about the past. It shows how history isn't just a static collection of facts, but something that we actively engage with and interpret.
So it's not just about what happened, but also about how we choose to remember it and what lessons we draw from it. Can you give us some examples of how different people throughout history have viewed the Western Schism?
Absolutely. Let's start with Ferdinand Gregorovius, a 19th century historian. He took a rather critical view of the papacy during this time while acknowledging the Church's ability to endure. Gregorovius saw the Avignon papacy and the ensuing schism as evidence of a moral decline and corruption within the church.
So for him, this wasn't just a political crisis, but a spiritual one as well. He saw the popes becoming too worldly, too entangled in secular affairs, and losing sight of their spiritual mission. It's a pretty harsh judgment.
It is, but this view was actually shared by many historians and reformers. During that time, they saw the schism as a wake-up call, a sign that the church needed a serious overhaul.
So they saw this turmoil as an opportunity for positive change. But I imagine not everyone saw it that way. Were there other, perhaps more positive interpretations?
Yes, there were. Take, for example, Joseph de Maistre, a French counter-revolutionary philosopher and a staunch defender of papal authority.
Maistre is an interesting figure, a complex thinker. He was fiercely opposed to the French Revolution, but he also believed that the papacy was crucial for maintaining order in society and preventing tyranny.
You've hit the nail on the head. He viewed the Western Schism not as a sign of weakness, but rather as proof of the papacy's strength. His argument was that if the church could survive such a tumultuous period, it could survive anything.
So for de Maistre, the schism actually reinforced his belief in the divine nature of the church and the importance of the pope. It's amazing how the same historical event can be seen in such completely different ways.
It really is. It highlights the fact that history is never truly neutral or objective. We all approach it with our own perspectives shaped by the times we live in and our own personal beliefs.
That makes sense. So for us as Catholics today, how should we approach this period of church history? What lens should we use to understand it? It can be hard to know what to make of all this, especially if you're trying to reconcile this history with your faith.
You are right. It's a lot to process. I think the best way to approach it is with an open mind and a willingness to ask tough questions. Don't shy away from the complexities, the contradictions, or the human failings.
Because those are the areas where we often discover the most meaningful truths.
Precisely, the Western Schism, even with all its chaos and confusion, offers us a valuable opportunity to learn about the church, its leaders, and its ability to adapt and evolve over time. It can challenge our assumptions, deepen our understanding of faith and authority, and ultimately strengthen our commitment to the church. Remember, embracing our history, even the messy parts, is part of what it means to be Catholic.
That's a great reminder. We need to approach our faith with honesty and a desire to understand rather than shying away from the difficult parts of our history.
Exactly. The Western Schism, though, a turbulent time, ultimately highlights the church's resilience and its capacity for renewal.
This deep dive has been quite a journey. We've explored the origins of the Western Schism, the rise and fall of rival popes, the attempts to resolve the crisis, and the lasting impact it had on the church. It's been a story of human ambition, political maneuvering, and yes, even faith and resilience.
We hope you, our listeners, will continue to explore this fascinating period of church history. What you've heard today is just the tip of the iceberg. Keep digging, keep asking questions, and see what other insights you can uncover.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time for another exploration of history, faith, and the human experience.